2026 is going to be a wild year in Maine politics. Consider this, Senator Susan Collins appears ready to run again. While she has not officially announced her candidacy, she has previously stated it's her intention. With Janet Mills terming out, there is an open seat to be Maine's governor. While there are a great deal of questions about how things will play out in those races, Maine Political Science Chair Mark Brewer says that former Governor Paul LePage's decision to file to run for Congress provides an answer.
The biggest chip that we know for sure is that if he follows through and he seeks this nomination, that nomination is going to be his. He settles the Republican field, I think. Will there be maybe a couple other Republicans at the margin that no one really knows who they are? Might they throw their hat in? Maybe. But if he wants that nomination, it's his, right? So I think that's the one big thing that we know of for sure.
Brewer does wonder, if elected, how LePage would fare as a congressman. He points out that his experience professionally and as a politician has been as an executive. The House of Representatives would be a much more collaborative existence.